Welcome, everybody. It's a privilege and really a great pleasure to be with you. Hopefully, some of the warmth in places where you live will make it here to Boston as well. Today, we're actually going to talk about the period before the American Revolution. How did Jews get to North America? And actually, how did they get to the New World? What's the prehistory? So let's get started. If you could start the PowerPoint, please. And we usually begin, next slide, please. We usually begin with in the year 1654, which is when Jews sailed into New Amsterdam. But I'd like to start, because it's less known, why were they in the New World altogether? And the answer to that really takes us back to the Old World. As you know, Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492. A significant number, made their way eventually to Holland, settling largely in Amsterdam, because Holland was Calvinist and welcomed Jews against Catholic Spain. They also allowed a great synagogue, which became a model for early New World synagogue. Some of you perhaps have been to the Sephardic and Ashkenazic synagogues in Amsterdam. And then Holland, which had a great empire, decided, like everybody else, to go in to the colonies business. They needed a toehold in the New World, and the reason they wanted that toehold has everything to do with sugar. Sugar in those days was, I don't know, like cotton in the 19th century or oil in the 20th century. The sugar was in the New World, especially in Brazil. And so it was that Holland captured, next slide, please, captured from Portugal, which had been there before, a little toehold. In Brazil, you can see it on your screen, Recife, in the area of Pernambuco. Now, that becomes a very significant Jewish community for the simple reason that the Dutch, in order to encourage merchants to go across the ocean, offered Jews great incentives. They offered them rights that Jews had really never had before, and really equality in a way that would not come to European Jews until what we call emancipation in the 19th century. So the New World, in a way, anticipates developments that are going to be central in European history much later. The Jewish community of Recife dates to 1630, and approximately a third or to a half of the white community of Recife is Jewish, an extraordinary number. They have a rabbi, they have a synagogue, they have Jewish education, but it now let me just say a word about why they were so eager to bring Jews to Recife. The answer is that they needed merchants for two main reasons. We're going to have a colony, you got to bring goods there and back and trade and so on. And they believed Jews were good for that. And in addition, a rather unfortunate and ugly story, there was going to be trade in slaves, because if you had sugar, which they did, you needed slaves in order to harvest that sugar. Slavery is part of the reason, later cotton, why, or sugar is one part of the reason why slavery develops as it does. Now, if you wonder why Recife, take a look at the next map, and next slide, please, and you'll see that Recife actually is about as close as you can get to the slave markets in Africa. It actually should say slaves on your screen, and sugar in Brazil, and there was that trade. That's why they selected that little ridge of Recife, and it became the Dutch outpost, in a major Dutch outpost, not the only one, in the New World, and attracts lots of Jews. And we actually, I mean, it's sad, but one should know it. We actually have a picture, next slide, that was drawn by one of the soldiers of the slave market. And you can really see, I'm going to, the next slide, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. Next slide explains where it was from. No question, the Jews were involved in that trade, but so were Catholics and Protestants. Slavery was basic to the economy. As my own teacher, David Bryan Davis, used to point out, both blacks and Jews were victims of empire. The Jews benefited in the sense that they got these rights because the Dutch needed them. The Africans suffered because the Dutch needed them as well, but for different reasons. But both were victims of the larger imperial enterprise centered around the quest to increase the amount of sugar. Now, next slide, please. Recife is interesting because it's a one-generation Jewish community. There have been numbers of Jewish communities over the years that really lasted one generation. Cuba, more or less, Cachibamba in Bolivia, and others, and we forget about them. But it was important. They partly, as I said, because it offered an alternative vision based on legal equality and commercial opportunity. Jews could practice their religion openly. They could trade. Market forces triumphed over traditional prejudices. But it didn't last. The Portuguese, next slide, please, came back, and in 1654, they recaptured Recife from the Dutch, and they gave the Jews, and by the way, also the Protestants, 3 months to leave. Jewish history gives an important lesson. If you're given 3 months to leave, take the hint. And the Jews did. Many go back to Amsterdam, but Amsterdam was economically in dire straits after the loss of Recife. So the majority of Jews scatter to the Protestant islands of the Caribbean. The Caribbean then and now has islands that are mostly Protestant, islands that are mostly Catholic. The most important community the Jews go to is Curacao, which you can see there just above Venezuela. Venezuela was Catholic. Curacao was Calvinist Protestant. There certainly were Jews in Curacao who went back underground and traded in Venezuela, but Jews are not allowed to live in Venezuela until the time of Bolivar in the 19th century. And there were plenty of rabbis who were furious at traders who went back to their Catholic identity in order to trade in Venezuela. Some of those Jews, don't tell anyone, but they actually had a family in Venezuela and a family in Curacao, and much later that would be discovered. Other Jews go to the Barbados, to St. Eustatius, which plays an important role as a smuggling center in the American Revolution, has a lot of Jews. Nevis, where Alexander Hamilton was born, and other communities, Jamaica, and 23 Jews go to one of the least important Dutch settlements in the New World. They had much worse weather also than the Caribbean. They go into the port of New Amsterdam. There are all sorts of theories. Were they blown off course? Did pirates bring them? The answer is that we don't have a lot of documents as to what they were doing and why. Nobody knew that they were going to be important. But they, in September of 1654, sail in to the port of New Amsterdam. Next slide, please. And that's when our story of the Jews in North America begins. The governor of New Amsterdam, later known as New York, the Dutch governor, was Peter Stuyvesant. There you can see him. And he was perhaps because he had himself studied for the Calvinist ministry. There's an old biography of Peter Stuyvesant that reports that Stuyvesant had been a student for the ministry in Holland, and then it laconically observes, unfortunately, something happened to the daughter of his landlady, and Peter Stuyvesant decided to go abroad. Those of you who are trained in history may have your suspicions. That's all I know. But he was deeply religious. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that he was not exactly thrilled by the coming of Jews. He calls them deceitful, repugnant, hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. And he hopes that his boss, the Dutch West India Company, they were, so to speak, the investors to whom he had to answer. He hoped that they would allow him to throw the Jews out. And then Stuyvesant, in what I believe to be the most important statement he makes, says, giving them, meaning the Jews, liberty, we cannot refuse the Lutherans. and the papists, the Catholics, yeah, there goes the neighborhood. But what Stuyvesant was really saying is that this decision about whether to admit Jews would really determine the religious, social character of New Amsterdam. And he was right. Stuyvesant wanted a vast majority, if not all, to be Dutch Calvinists. That way, religion could be policed, and order would be maintained, and there would be one religion. But the Dutch West India Company really wanted to bring people to this new colony. They were not eager to exclude, they wanted to include. Stuyvesant was forever trying to persuade them to oust people, not just Jews, but Quakers. They wouldn't even fight, he said. And the Dutch West India Company advised him to shut your eyes. Fascinating. Don't worry about people's religion. As long as they don't break the law and they do business for the colony and pay their taxes, you let them stay. And that, in fact, is what happens. And that will determine the character of New Amsterdam. And that made it all the more inviting for Jews. Historically, Jews have preferred heterogeneous communities, places where there are all sorts of religions, where they're not the only out group. And so it certainly was in New Amsterdam. Next slide, please. And here you see their response. They turn him down, partly because Jews are investors in the new Dutch West India Company, partly because they suffered for the mother country in Recife, and partly because they thought that it was good business. And so they rule that Jews may travel and trade and live and remain. Every one of those words is important. They can go back and forth. If they leave, they can come back. And not only can they live there, but their children can live there. They can remain, with one important caveat, that they not become a burden, the poor not become a burden either to the Dutch West India Company or to the community, which means to the church, which took care of the poor, but be supported by their own nation. Of course, the Jews were happy to agree with that because they had long traditions of taking care of their own, and that becomes dominant. And it's interesting to study the early years. Like a baby is often shaped by its early years, so a community, time and again, is shaped by its early years. And here we have it. Jews are here early. They're not latecomers. They are given rights. They are one of many. And efforts to shape a different kind of homogeneous community are thwarted. Next slide, please. Now, New Amsterdam is not the only, it is the first but not the only colony. We know much more about it. There are more papers. But in bold, you see the other colonies. Someone in the chat had mentioned that they were from Savannah. Savannah, under Oglethorpe, is a group colony, meaning Jews as a group, since he opened Savannah, travel there, and rather quickly the Sephardic Jews get frightened because Spain was, if you look at that map right there in Florida, was Spain, and they feared an invasion, so they leave pretty fast. But the Ashkenazim are still there, the same families. There are Sheftals in Savannah and Minuses in Savannah who go back to the very beginning. And then we move north, Charleston, Philadelphia, New York City, and Newport. In the French colonies, someone asked about New Orleans, Jews were not really allowed to live. We know there actually were Jews secretly in New Orleans, but under the Code Noir, which governed those communities until the Louisiana Purchase in the 19th, under Thomas Jefferson in the early 19th century, Jews are not legally allowed to live there. But all of these five, Savannah, Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, and Newport, not only had Jews, but Jewish community. And I want to emphasize that. There certainly were individual Jews who had wandered into North America earlier. They came, they traded, they left. We may or may not know about them. What's important here is that you had community. And actually, absent community, Jewish life can't continue. So the community and the fact, as we'll see, that there's synagogue communities, there are Jews worshiping in all of those five cities, south to north, is very important. All of the places where Jews settle in numbers are port cities, and that is no accident. That's what Jews did. Others were farmers, some of them in the South, gentlemen farmers, meaning they had plantations, other people did the work. But not the Jews. The Jews everywhere were merchants. They traveled a great deal, but port cities, which is a concept developed first in European Jewish history, port cities, and why don't we move to the next slide where we talk about that, are characterized by these points. They're merchants, they travel a great deal, they anticipate modernity. Religion is based in the synagogue. And not everybody is religious, as Jacob Rader Marcus the great historian of colonial Jewry, he said there were as many Judaisms as there were Jews. Unlike in Stettlach, in little communities in Eastern Europe, though everybody was Jewish, or a vast majority, here Jews are immersed in Christian culture. They have all sorts of ties to Christians. They trade with them, they know the government, they assimilate some of the surrounding practices. And when I say segmental Jewish life and identity, that basically means that part of them is American, part of them is Jewish. They keep those separate. They're interconnected, but as with Jews in the modern period, they're also part of their business, and many of them had partners even who were not Jewish. And all of that anticipates modernity. So let's do the next slide, please. they have to organize. And those Jews really form what I like to call synagogue communities, because the community and the synagogue were really one and the same. In some of the places, it was only a rented synagogue, a rented space. Certainly that's true in Savannah. In New York, Jews are not really given public ability to worship. They could worship in private, meaning in a private home, but not in public until the 18th century. Until, just about the turn of the 18th century under the British. But the point is that the synagogue was home to all of the area's Jews, and it was responsible for their religious life, not just worship, but it oversaw kashrut, dietary laws. It oversaw life cycle. It would oversee the cemetery, which is very valuable, because a strange thing about Jews, even if they don't like their fellow Jews in this world, they want to be buried with their fellow Jews so they can be with them in the next world. And that gave the synagogue a lot of power. You misbehave, we won't give you a nice spot, or maybe no spot at all in the Jewish cemetery. That was a very important threat, and we'll see how Jews responded after the American Revolution. But before then, it controlled that. They oversaw education and philanthropy. They maintained ties to Jews around the world. We occasionally have letters asking religious questions or seeking funds. And it oversaw not only the cemetery, but the ritual bath. Increasingly, we are discovering that those ritual baths, which have turned up all over the New World, were very important. They believed that the coming of the New World would hasten the coming of the Messiah. Why hadn't the Messiah come, they asked. Simple. The Messiah will only come when Jews are in all four corners of the earth. And we'd missed the corner because we didn't know about the New World. But now that we are in the New World, this is the theology of Menashe ben Israel. Now that we are in the New World, the Messiah will come very soon. That will also justify the great tragedy of the Spanish expulsion. Hard to explain. It was the birth pangs of the Messiah, and they believed the Messiah was coming quickly. That's also, by the way, why so many synagogues are called Mikveh Yisrael. That was the name of Menashe ben Israel's book. And the synagogue comes to represent the Jewish community. It will speak for Jews, and it's the place where Jews gather. Let's move on, because I want to leave time for your questions. We are, of course, dealing with a very small number of Jews. Even by the end of the colonial period, it's only about 1,500 to 2,000 Jews. Jews are about 1/10 of 1% of the population, but because they were concentrated, their numbers are more important than one might expect. So in, say, Newport, which becomes a Jewish community of size in the 25 years prior to the American Revolution, it's a free port. It becomes very significant in trade, and whale oil is almost monopolized by Jews, whale oil being very pure and desired and prized. Spermaceti is the word for whale oil. But in Newport, the Jews were very significant. And we have tax records, and one can see that the leading taxpayers were Jews. So they were far beyond their numbers in significance in places like Newport and New Amsterdam, Philadelphia, Charleston. I'm so sorry. Philadelphia and Charleston and Savannah less so. They were much smaller. Now let's talk about the values, because again, we can learn certain things from looking at the young age of the Jewish community in the New World and talk a little bit about its values. One is tradition. That's central in Sephardic life, even to this day. They had prayers in Portuguese, even though they've been expelled from Portugal. Our duty is to imitate our forefathers. But it was very powerful because a Jewish merchant could travel from community to community, even back to Amsterdam or London, and certainly to the Caribbean, and feel at home. The synagogue felt the same way. The key tunes were identical. And that was very valuable to a small community seeking identity. And of course, marriages would take place, and the differences were less significant than the similarities. Another value was deference. You had to submit to your betters. There was no rabbi. There's not going to be a rabbi in North America until 1840. But you had a chazan. He led the prayers. He was the central religious figure. The most famous was Gershom Satius. But he was under the direct rule of the leaders, the Parnas, as they were called, the president and the board of the synagogue. My view is they didn't want a rabbi. These communities, even Jewishly, were a bit somewhat diverse. And as we move on, more and more Ashkenazic Jews join the Sephardic synagogue, which still maintains its Sephardic character. And they thought that a rabbi would have trouble with such a diverse group. Surrounding Protestant churches, many of them were lay-led, and they did not feel much of a push, more of a push in the Caribbean. But they didn't feel much of a push to have a rabbi. There were occasional visiting rabbis like Karigal who come and help them out. The Chazan is given the title often in English minister, which is not an exact translation, but tells us that the Chazan wanted to have the status of his Calvinist counterparts, but there are limits. If he wants to speak or wants to make some kind of rule, he has to get permission from the leaders of the congregation. And authority is enforced via fines, rare excommunication. And people accepted that sense of discipline. But of course, fines only work if there's one synagogue in town, which there is in every colonial community. The minute we see multiple synagogues, as will happen in the 19th century, the system of fines breaks down, because if they want to fine me for misbehavior in the synagogue, in the first synagogue, so I'll just go to the other one, which is their competitor. And the system disappeared. I suspect nobody in this audience has ever received a fine from his synagogue, but it was very common when there was but one synagogue, and people paid those fines. Let's keep going. Colonial Jews live in two worlds. And that's going to be true of Jews in the New World forever after. They live in a Jewish world and what we might call a worldly domain. Some of them compartmentalized. So one of the richest Jews in the late colonial period, Aaron Lopez, literally had two names. His business friends called him Duarte, which was his name back on the Iberian Peninsula where he was born. In Portugal, Jews in the synagogue call him Aaron. And there were others who had very close partnerships with non-Jews in economic life, but obviously did not partner with them religiously. The problem, and we see this already in the colonial period, occurs when those two worlds clash. Jews have a different Sabbath. They have different holidays. They have dietary laws. And even then, we know there were people who kept kosher at home, but certainly ate anything outside. We also know there were people who carried knives with them. They wouldn't have been able to get on an airplane, but they carried knives in order to be able to slaughter certainly chickens while they were traveling. We know that about 15% of Jews intermarry. Jews are diverse, but they all feel part of the nation. The men are always circumcised. It's very important. They believe in one God. They believe in the Messiah. As I said, they think Messiah is pretty imminent. And let's just summarize, and then we'll take questions. Next slide, please. On the eve of the American Revolution, Jews are one of many dissenting churches. They're minority. They're not Dutch Calvinists. They're not Protestant at all. But there are lots of dissenting churches. The Jewish community, especially as time moves on, is internally diverse. More and more Ashkenazim. Philadelphia, the great majority are Jews from German lands rather than the Iberian Peninsula. It's a diverse community, but they worship according to the Western Sephardic tradition. Every synagogue community, from south to north, every one of them is independent, not like countries where there's a central synagogue, London, let's say, that rules all of the others. Each of these communities said, we are independent. And Judaism is in two settings, the synagogue and the home, but Jews and Christians mix in the street, very different than would be true in Eastern European Jewish communities. It's not a fiddler on the roof kind of community. And a kinship is very important. Even if you didn't know them very well, they're your family. And you can see that when we study the business ties, Jews preferred and trusted their family, what one historian calls the familiarity of strangers. You didn't know them well, they may even have been your brother's children in another Jewish community, but you preferred them because they were part of the family in the Italian mafia sense. And finally, and we'll see this next time, great changes are going to happen with the American Revolution. It's called a revolution for a reason. Nevertheless, there are aspects of this early colonial life that are going to shape American Jewish living forever after. So let me stop there and take any questions. I saw some pop up.
Terrific. I've gone through, we have some great questions that we'll try to discuss in the next 15 minutes. Thank you for setting the stage for our 1 month. Who knew we were all Sephardim, you know? No, I guess I did because I did a lot of research, but maybe some other people did not know. So here's some questions that I will ping you with. First of all, when you showed the other communities growing on the eastern seaboard and different from Savannah up to Newport, Rhode Island, one question was, why didn't the Jews go to one place? Why didn't they all just go to New Amsterdam? Why do you see so many different communities popping up at that time?
Yeah, it's a good question, and each is its own story. Um, I don't have time to go into each story, but we know that first of all, there were, as I said, with Savannah, that's totally distinctive. It's the only community that was really a community is sent to the New World. The idea that of sending them was, we can't really afford to take care of you forever, and we don't think that you're going to be able to succeed in London or Amsterdam, but we'll give you a free one-way ticket to Savannah, which says it's welcoming everybody. And then do your best. I don't think Oglethorpe, when he issued his call, expected to get Jews, but they came, and actually they came with significant knowledge, especially about grapes and medicine and so on, and so they stay. Charleston is fed by a Caribbean colony, and always is influenced that way. Newport has Jews from Iberia who come out of the closet, so to speak, and or are expelled or have to run away. But Newport is a boomtown from 1850s on, and Jews are central to that boom. It will, of course, come crashing down after the revolution, but they are going to have enough money to build a beautiful synagogue, and the finest architect of the day, Peter Harrison. Maybe some of you have been there, the Turo Synagogue. Philadelphia doesn't have too many Jews until the revolution. Its leading Jews are actually Ashkenazim, the Gratz family. As the name implies, Gratz is in Austria, it's still there. And the Gratz family is there, but they decide, well, this is the local custom. We will follow it, and it's going to grow once the revolution leads Jews to run away from some of the endangered colonies. There are a lot moved to Philadelphia, and then Philadelphia as the seat of government is an important place to be.
So many different reasons for why those different areas became the initial Jewish areas. you emphasize that the Sephardim really are the first ones to come here, but you also mentioned the Ashkenazim. So when was there a switch between having more Ashkenazim coming in, and why did they come at that particular time when they came?
Well,
Early time.
the Ashkenazim come as merchants. In some cases, people began to hear about the New World and its opportunities, and they would come and try their luck. In New York, you have a majority of Ashkenazim by 1730. In Savannah, as I said, the Sephardim ran away, fearing Spanish invasion. Remember, the Inquisition could only touch Jews who had converted to Christianity and then returned, which the Inquisition considered to be a violation of the law. It couldn't touch Ashkenazim. So that's why the Ashkenazim stay in Georgia, the Sephardim run away. But the large Ashkenazi community, as we know, in the 18th century, there are all sorts of attacks on Jewish communities, or occasionally there were fires in Jewish communities, like Chaim Solomon, the revolutionary hero. He started, I think, moving when a fire destroyed his hometown. Jews were rather mobile for a variety of reasons, and as there are more and more boats, of course, still sailboats, but as there are more and more boats to the New World, some of them had Ashkenazi Jews. But we're not going to see an Ashkenazi synagogue until the 19th century. They see the value of all being together. Yeah.
And which was the first Ashkenazi synagogue?
In New York, the first Ashkenazi synagogue is B'nai Jeshurun. In this year, it celebrated 1825-26. Its history. There are Rodef Sholem in Philadelphia is Ashkenazic very early. There are reports of a minyan, Ashkenazic minyan in Charleston, but it doesn't last. So
just I wanted to mention. So I'm going to share slides from that or the PowerPoint from each program in the follow-up, so you'll be able to kind of look at some of the material again. We're also recording programs. It's going to be up in our CSP member YouTube area, and if you're a member of CSP, you can watch programs again or watch ones you've missed. If you're not a member, please do support us. That is a member benefit for this month. You know, I've did a lot of research. I grew up, my family's from Africa. We moved to Boston when I was 7, and I've really started studying the history of the Boston Jewish community as I come back over the last 25 years. I learned much more about the history of Jews in Boston than I ever knew living in Boston, and I used your materials a lot to figure it out. But what I learned really was there wasn't much, and there's a reason for it, but there was a reason why Newport had the community, and it was based on, I think you mentioned, a balance between economic versus traditional, I think, religious forces, right? And so if the economic balances were higher, that was the fertile ground for the Jews. So these port cities, if you had leaders in those port cities who valued economics and over traditional forces, Jews were succeeded. If it was the other way around, which is what happened in Boston, you didn't have Jews. And so thank you for kind of putting that out there for everybody.
Boston is the most homogeneous community in all of the colonies. The Puritans chased out people who weren't like them. And so when Jews came to Boston, it wasn't inviting. We know of 1 or 2 Jews who try and settle there, and they don't remain. The Puritans like to talk about how Hebraic they were, but they didn't like real live Jews very much, and it wasn't comfortable. And so Boston is a very late Jewish community in terms of building a synagogue and a community. But Newport, anyone who was a dissenter, like Roger Williams, well, we send our dissenters to Rhode Island. It was full of, we might call them religious mishugoyim, that's a technical term, of people who had crazy views. Anne Hutchison, and each one found a little place in Rhode Island for their colony. And so having Jews fit right in. And we know that the Ezra Stiles there, he was fascinated with the Jews, and that made them particularly welcome.
One of my most favorite Jews of this period, who translates into the colonial period, is Moses Michael Hayes. I'm surprised as to how many people have never heard of Moses Michael Hayes, and obviously, and you mentioned Aaron Lopez. I'm sure people don't know about him. And many of these were conversos who came to America, came back to their Judaism, and became immensely wealthy and successful. So I guess my question for you is, are there any other names we should know before I get to my last question? Any other Jews from this period that we should know? Maybe one or two, and we can follow up. I can send a follow-up as well. But they're just fascinating people who
Moses Michael
lost to history.
Is, after the revolution, is going to be very important. He comes to Boston after the revolution, and fascinatingly,
From Newport.
Right, from Newport, because Newport doesn't survive really the revolution, and never recovered from the economic catastrophe of the revolution. But what's interesting is how he lives proudly as a Jew without a community. And what's really important is that he raises his sister's two children after her husband, who was Reverend Turo, Chazan Turo of Newport. He supported the British. He has to run off after the revolution. He can't remain. And he goes to the Caribbean and quickly, unfortunately, died. And she comes back, lives in Boston, and he raises these two children, Abraham and Judah, both of whom become very wealthy. Judah settles in New Orleans and owns a good bit of the port. And again, he's moving there right after the Louisiana Purchase, and is unbelievably successful economically. And Abraham stays in Boston, and there was still the Bunker Hill Monument was half paid for by Judah Turo, because he was actually born during the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he was very proud of that.
Amazing stories that people should know and don't know. And we don't have more time, but let me ask one or two more things. One is people are asking about the slave trade and the Jews, and I think we maybe will give them some more background. I guess the most important question that people asked was, from your perspective, given the history you showed us of the Jews coming to Recife, from Recife to New Amsterdam, and also settling in the Caribbean. And you mentioned Alexander Hamilton, so I have to ask the question, do you believe Alexander Hamilton was Jewish? That's the question. You're the historian. There's also a question about Jewish pirates.
That book, and it's a good book by Andrew Pourwancher. Look, he found some remarkable documents on the island of Nevis. And I think that there is good evidence that Hamilton studied in a Jewish school, who exactly his mother was, and whether she was Jewish or only cohabited with a Jew. Um, all I can say is I have never seen evidence that he self-identified as a Jew in New York. We have a lot of New York records. Not one of them says, go talk to that secret Yid, Alexander Hamilton. Nor is it, although Porwancher shows that Hamilton defended Jews, which is very interesting, it turns out there were other Jews who were closer to Aaron Burr, and given the choice, went to study law with him. So all I can say is I'm always a little nervous when, 250 years later, we discover that someone was a Jew who never talked of themselves as Jews. Certainly none of his descendants claimed to be Jewish. Um, and But it is certainly possible that he had a closer association with Jews as a child and knew Hebrew and so on, because of that background in the Jewish community of Nevis, about which we know very little. Nevis, we have from archaeology and only a few documents that Porwancher discovered.
Thank you. There are people putting in the chat that the Curacao synagogue you mentioned is still active. People can go visit there,
Yes,
which is
yes, yes.
true. You could daven, I guess, on the sand there. There are people putting in their favorite synagogues from this time period in Savannah. My
Yeah.
wife is a Chazan, so she's gonna be very happy to know that the Chazans ruled here. And there's the question of, did the Chazans have that much power when they were in the Sephardic world and the Ashkenazi world back in the old world, or did they really only get that power here in America for that period of time?
As it's later, it'll be happen in America as well. As rabbis rise, Cantor's status falls. So when there are no rabbis, the Chazan, as I said, often called himself the minister, like Seixas, had tremendous status and power. He was the teacher, and many questions he handled. He was the most
Right. The question,
learned Jew in town.
so why were there no rabbis at that period of time?
Well,
Why
as
didn't
I
they
said,
come?
yeah, I mean, I think that in the New World, I mean, it wasn't so exciting to come to a small community, but we did have rabbis in many of those colonial of the Caribbean community, Curacao. The Sephardim called them a chacham, but there were rabbis in many other places. And the answer, I think, is that the leaders really didn't want a rabbi. They wanted to run the show, and they thought having a rabbi would make trouble. And since their neighbors didn't have ministers, only about a quarter of New York churches had a minister, they didn't feel that their status was diminished by the absence of a rabbi. Where you had, let's say, the Archbishop of Canterbury or a cardinal or some leading Christian, Jews usually wanted a Jewish counterpart, let's say, in the Sephardic world, a Chacham Bashi, as he would be known. But you didn't have that in North America. And so you had a bunch of learned lay people, um, uh, uh, some of whom knew how to chant the prayers, and some were very good, some not so good. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're out of time, so I want to just do a promo for what's going to happen this week. On Tuesday at our members series, we're going to talk about the evolution of Judaism in America. And then which kind of ties into some of the things we've talked. It's a spiral learning opportunity because much of what we cover in each of these sessions is going to impact something that we cover in another session. You don't have to attend all of them, but you will probably see that overlap. And then on Thursday, we talk about politics, Jews and politics. So they came here. How involved were they? How did they get more involved? The evolution of Jews in politics over the years from of over 250 years plus. So that's kind of our trajectory. What are we doing next Sunday in this particular series? We're focusing on mobility and the evolution of the Jewish communities in America.
Addressing me, yes. Next week, we're going to take the story really from the American Revolution, really through the Gilded Age. So we're gonna skip a lot. But the idea is to really trace how this tiny community, 1/10 of 1%, grows into a community by the end of the Gilded Age that is going to be almost 1 million strong by 1900 and spread all across the United States. So it's a very dramatic set of changes that takes place from the Revolution through 1900.
Great. And if you haven't been to the Museum of American Jewish History, it's called the Weitzman Museum, I believe,
Yeah,
in
Weitzman, named for Stuart
Philadelphia.
Weitzman.
You should
Yeah,
go. However, I think we're going to try to organize a CSP tour there.
great.
It is a fantastic museum, really is. And you go up to the top floor and you make your way down, and the top floor takes you from early American Jewish history to contemporary as you get your way down to the main floor. I recommend you go if you're in the Philly area. It's easy to get to. New York is easy to get to, but we'll organize something from CSP because it's a special place and ties into everything we'll be exploring this month. So thank you, Professor Sarna, for the first program. Thank you all for joining us today. Who knew about the messianic origins of our people? I knew about the Sephardic stuff. Now I got to look at now I understand Mikveh Israel much better. Thank you. And yeah, the balance between market forces and traditional forces. Maybe that's part of the story of how we grow in the United States. Thank you all. Have a great Sunday. Keep warm wherever you are. Keep healthy, and we'll see you Tuesday. Take care. Bye,
See you then.
everybody.
Bye bye.